Any TV, any video is good. I know you have to ask me, but no, I don't. My wife has more problems with that. She said, "You're all over the place on the internet." I said, "So, no big deal." No, it's a good thing. So, but you know, so you're recording it, right?
I've got it.
Okay, no, that's fine. Yeah, no, I don't have any problem with that. Whoops. Like I said, TV. There's a method to that madness also. Wrong way.
We'll get started properly in like 2 minutes. We're
All right.
like 2 minutes.
Like I said, there's a method to that TV madness, which you will see. People of my age love Batman because it was so camp. It was the campiest show ever on TV.
Came back to people my generation because Adam West became a really phenomenal voice actor.
Oh, I know.
Stuff I watched growing up, like Futurama, where he kind of played himself. He was the mayor on Family Guy.
Yes, he was.
Played himself, and he was so funny.
Yeah, well, he was hysterical in Batman. That whole series was absolutely. It was a comic book that came to life. But my 1966 talk, I really talk about the Batman phenomenon, which lasted only about 6 months.
And you've got like Eartha Kitt as Catwoman. I mean, just some really great things going on.
Yeah, well, you'll see as I open up. And we do talk about Catwoman, believe it or not. Again, it's through the prism of television in 1968 when I was 11 and 12 years old. So that was. I do a lot of the 60s talks because I got 60s talk. I'm going to work on 60, 61, 62, but I got 63 to 69. And it's all through how television just shaped everything in the 1960s. Because it was the first generation that really saw things live, because everything in the 50s wasn't live. But in the 60s, Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald's killed on TV in front of everybody. The end of the innocence. So anyway, I'll just wait for you to start up.
Well, we are at 2 o'clock, so I will say.
And we got a whole bunch of participants.
My name is Veronica Reynolds. I'm the head of community relations at the New City Library. I'm really pleased to welcome Evan back. He did baseball and American culture over the summer. Jill's asking, we are starting right now, Jill. So if she's having issues, she can give me a call in a moment, and I'm happy to help her. I'll put my phone number in the chat. Sorry. There we go, doing a little tech support there. But we are really thrilled to have Evan back. We are going to record this lecture, so if there's someone you think would love it and is missing it, it'll be up on our YouTube channel by the end of next week. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to the expert. I will be here the whole time. You can put questions in the chat. We're going to do questions at the end, but if you're having any technical issues or you can't hear anything like that, put that in the chat and I am happy to get to you. And then at the end, we can unmute and ask questions out loud. So even if you can't see me, I'm here, and I will turn you over to our thrilling speaker of the day.
Okay, thank you, Veronica. Thank you for inviting me to the New City Library. I went to Spring Valley Senior High School, which is not very far from New City or Clarkstown North or Clarkstown South. And I started my career at Spring Valley High School in radio and TV at the age of 15 in 1971 on WRKL radio. I was with WGRC radio later in the decade, and at the age of 21, I was on WNEW AM radio because of something that happened at the Tappan Zee Townhouse. There was a Democratic New York State fundraiser in March of 1978. I was 21 years old. I was a year ahead in college, so I graduated earlier. And my boss at WGRC, Steve North, said, go down to the Tappan Zee Townhouse and see what you get. And what I got was John Lindsay telling me that he was running for Senate from New York in 1980. And that eventually got me on WNEW radio as a stringer, the Northern Suburb stringer, and among my assignments at WNEW. In 1980, I was up in Bear Mountain interviewing Ronald Reagan. I also was helping out at the Democratic National Convention in 1980, Ted Kennedy's campaign in New Jersey during the presidential primary as well. And my last story at WNEW was the Brinks robbery in Nyack. That day, I think it was October 20th, 1981. Anyway, that's part of my background. And we're talking about 1968 here. And 2 years ago, I got an assignment from the Larchmont Library. Paul over at the Larchmont Library called me up one day and he said, we're doing, this is in April of 2018. He says, we're doing a retrospective on the 1960s. And I heard you did some radio and TV. And he said, can you do something on 1968? And can you do it through the lens of a television? I said, that's not that difficult. Sure, I could do that. And you may recognize that woman trying to sell you a television. The woman who is trying to sell you a television, if you were of a certain age back in the 1960s, you would recognize her immediately as the co-host and the intellectual brain of the Today Show, at least according to Joe Garagiola. Everybody wanted to make sure that they got up to the standards that Barbara Walters had. Joe told me that Barbara Walters was the smartest person he ever met in his life. Barbara Walters, you Downs were the co-hosts of the Today Show, and some people got their news about Vietnam and other things when they woke up in the morning and they watched Barbara and they watched you and they watched Joe Garagiola along with Frank Blair on the Today Show. And Barbara there is trying to sell you a television. And those televisions had dials and they had knobs and they had rabbit ears. And I'll tell you, us 1960 survivors, we had a tough time watching TV. We had to get up and actually change the channel. The most burning question of 1968, who was the better Catwoman? Was it Julie Newmar? Or was it Eartha Kitt? I don't know who you're going to say it was the better Catwoman, but there is a method to the madness here because Eartha Kitt basically sacrificed her career because she went to the White House on January 19th, 1969, or rather 68. A lot of things that were going on that day in Washington. She goes to the White House and she is honored by Lady Bird Johnson as a successful woman. And Lady Bird Johnson is having a luncheon for all these successful women, including Eartha Kitt. And Eartha Kitt was against the Vietnam War. And she decided to ask a question that most people would not in a proper setting like this. And there's some people who say that she was rude, and there are other people said she was just asking a question, depending on what side of the fence you were on. And she asked Lady Bird Johnson, why are the boys still in Vietnam? Why are they there? 1968 is overshadowed by Vietnam, and there's a presidential election as well. And Lyndon Johnson's running for re-election. Well, Lady Bird Johnson really didn't answer her, but she told Lyndon, it's an old song, Lyndon told something from Tom Paxson, 1965. Anyway, she told Lyndon, and Lyndon called all of his buddies in Hollywood. And Catwoman, as you see there, Eartha Kitt, was blackballed from the entertainment industry and had to go to Europe. Hang on one second. I think, let me stop the video. Okay, we're back on. I don't know. I think I froze there, so I'm going to just repeat what Eartha Kitt said. Why are the boys still in Vietnam? Lyndon Johnson didn't like that. She got blackballed. She was off Batman. She was off American TV. She was out of movies. She wasn't getting any singing gigs, nothing. She had to go to Europe to keep her career going because she did ask one question. What are the boys doing there? And by the way, it wasn't just boys. A number of years ago, I did a talk about Vietnam, and a woman said to me, how come you say boys? There were girls there too. There were women who were nurses. There were women who were support staff in Vietnam. Don't forget, there were women in Vietnam. While Eartha Kitt is getting herself in trouble in the White House at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, there is a protest march. And it was run by an 87-year-old woman by the name of Jeannette Rankin, who was a congresswoman who started serving in 1917. So this is 50 years later. Welcome to the Jeannette Rankin Peace Parade, and the war in Vietnam, and the social crisis at home. The social crisis at home, relations between race relations, and the rioting in 1963 and 64 and 65 and Watson 66, and trouble elsewhere throughout the 1960s in the civil rights movement, and the war, and the social crisis at home. And at this point, there's another movement starting. It's called Women's Liberation. January 19th, 87-year-old Jeannette Rankin. She was a congresswoman from Montana. She was a congresswoman before women got the right to vote in 1920 for presidency. She voted against the U.S. participation in 1917, 1918 actually, 1917, and World War I and World War II. And she got 5,000 women on a cold and snowy day in Washington to march, to protest. And there was one other message that these women were trying to send besides end the social crisis in the Vietnam War. Sisterhood is powerful. You got to remember one thing about 1968. There was a Civil Rights Act that was passed on July 7th, 1964, but it left loopholes in the Civil Rights Act that impacted women. One of those loopholes was higher education. Women were not guaranteed the right for higher education in the United States in 1968. That would come 4 years later. Well, first of all, if I was live with you, I'd be asking a question. Did the North Korean or the Korean police action ever come to an end? Was there ever an end to the Korean War? The answer is no. It is an ongoing war. It is now 70 years old. And it's still smoldering out there. Every once in a while, there are a couple blazes that need to be put out. And in January of 1968, the 23rd of January, Lyndon Johnson had another South Asia or North Asia problem. North Korea seized the USS Pueblo. Lloyd Booker was the admiral of that ship. The North Koreans claimed the ship violated its territorial waters while spying. The ship is still in North Korea. It's a museum. The men were released about a year later, and it's one of the prizes that if you ever do go to North Korea, if you ever have the opportunity, and I'm not sure why you'd want to, but if you want to go to a museum and see an American ship, you would see the USS Pueblo that was seized. Vietnam. Richard Nixon is running for president in 1968. And Richard Nixon is of the belief that Vietnam might not be all that much of an issue in 1968 because the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive against South Vietnam on January 30th. The Viet Cong soldiers attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon the next day, yet they didn't go anywhere with it. The Americans would ultimately prevail over the Tet Offensive. However, the message was lost. And because the message was lost by Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam continues. And one of the reasons the message is lost is because of old Iron Pants. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America. Why was he the most trusted man in America? Because in 1963, on November 22nd, the day of the killing of John F. Kennedy, Cronkite is reading the bulletin that Kennedy is dead. He's got his glasses on, puts down the glasses, kind of sheds a tear a little bit, composes himself. The glasses go back on, and old Iron Pants is back in the saddle. You could trust him. And he's in Vietnam, and he's doing a report for CBS. CBS reports about Vietnam, and he's collecting all kinds of stories and other data that he's going to show America on February 27th, what is going on in Vietnam. Now, Cronkite was an old war correspondent. During the World War II, he was in Europe for the United Press International. By early February of 1968, 35% of Americans approved Lyndon Johnson's handling of the war. The so-called counterculture, young people, I'm not sure what the counterculture is. Nobody's ever explained the counterculture to me. It was one of those terms that was made up. Not like hippies. There were hippies, but hippies by February 1968 were gone. They were gone. There was the Diggers in San Francisco held the funeral for the hippie on October 6, 1967, and the hippies left no idea, no writings behind, nothing other than have a good time. But the Vietnam War is played out on TV, seen globally on a daily basis. Cronkite's report is coming out on February 27th, and yet there's some levity here. There are two shows on TV for the counterculture, for the hippie generation. One is these guys, Tommy Smothers on the left, Dick Smothers on the right. Now, they had some people on the show. I'm not sure whatever happened to them. They had a writer, what was his name? He had a famous father. His father did the Dick Van Dyke Show, and he was on Your Show of Shows with Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca, and he was the straight man for the 2,000-year-old man, Mel Brooks. Let's see, he did a show after that. Oh yeah, he did All in the Family. He was Meathead. Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner was one of the writers there. There was a guy who played the banjo there. It was another one of the writers. He used to have an arrow through his head while he played the banjo. I don't know whatever happened to him. Steve Martin. Mason Williams was on the show. Pat Paulson was on the show. And all of these people skewered Lyndon Johnson and skewered the Vietnam War. They were supposed to be on CBS to attract a younger audience, a more hip audience. That's what they did. But by doing that, they got Bill Paley, the CBS chairman and founder of CBS in 1967, very, very upset because he was upsetting Lyndon. They were upsetting Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson actually called Paley in the middle of the night to tell him, get those boys off me. The other show wasn't as devastating as the Smothers Brothers show. It was Rowan and Martin's Laughing. And yeah, there were a lot of jokes thrown at Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson, but that show later on in 1968 would change how people running for president would approach the job of running for president. But I don't want to get myself too far ahead here. The Smothers Brothers have a problem with Bill Paley. And Paley is getting increasingly upset at the Smothers Brothers because they're going after the war and they don't think the war is just. Tommy Smothers decides to invite Pete Seeger on the show. Pete Seeger, communist who was blacklisted in the 1950s. And Paley doesn't want to upset the apple cart because Smothers Brothers making CBS a lot of money, but he doesn't necessarily want Seeger on either because he was a communist. He was blacklisted in the McCarthy years. And so he decides, okay, you can have Pete Seeger on, but there's one particular song that we do not want him to sing. One song, please do not let him sing. The song was called Waist Deep in the Big Money. And yes, Pete Seeger did perform it on the show. It got by the censors on February 25th, 1968. The song was considered symbolic of the Vietnam War and Johnson's policy of escalation, then seen widely as pushing the United States deeper into an increasingly unpopular war. TV again, TV. So in February of 1968, you can see Ed McMahon there was a remarkable week of television on The Tonight Show. Now, Johnny Carson never got political. He didn't think that that was his as they said back in the 60s, it wasn't his bag. But he turned the show over to Harry Belafonte for a week and told Harry, go at it. And you could see the guests on this show included Dr. Martin Luther King, Paul Newman, who is a civil rights activist. And for 1 week, 90 minutes, Monday through Friday in February, it wasn't "Here's Johnny," and it wasn't "Ha ha ha ha" from Ed McMahon. Serious, serious discussion. Johnny Carson, like I said, he was a comedian who really didn't want to do the political thing. But he sensed there was a national mood of swelling anger, division over race. I don't know how he just sensed it. It was right there in front of him, with the Vietnam War and everything else that's going on in the United States. And he tells Harry Belafonte, go at it. The guest list from February 5th through the 9th, a remarkable week of television. Dionne Warwick, who sang the song Say a Little Prayer, that came out in 1967, which wasn't against Vietnam or pro-Vietnam, just, hey, remember my boyfriend, my husband is in Vietnam, and I say a little prayer for him so he doesn't get hurt. Aretha Franklin's on the show. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Senator Robert F. Kennedy from New York, Lena Horne, Diane Carroll, who was the first African-American lead in the TV show when she did that nurse show. Nipsey Russell, who, besides being the poet laureate of television, marched with Dr. King in the South. Bill Cosby, Buffy St. Marie, Aaron Williams, and Frida Payne. And they discussed what Carson told them to discuss that week. It was an interesting week of programming, and it has never been was never replicated on the Tonight Show, although both Merv Griffin and Mike Douglas on their syndicated shows during the daytime part of the TV schedule did have guests like that. A Report from Vietnam, another TV show, February 27th, played a major role in turning Americans against the war, and possibly, nobody can say for sure, although there are whispers, possibly inducing Johnson to abandon his reelection campaign. The campaign that Johnson was running was against George Wallace, who wasn't going to try to get the Democratic nomination, but he was going to run anyway on a segregation platform, which he did. And also Eugene McCarthy, who was the Dove candidate who wanted the United States to leave Vietnam. And it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that Richard Nixon would be the Republican standard bearer against Johnson in the 1968 election. The Report from Vietnam is on February 27th. And Cronkite says, the Americans, the best they can hope for here is a stalemate. They're not going to win this war. Johnson didn't like that. But during my days covering the National Basketball Association, almost 40 years ago now, Larry O'Brien was the commissioner of the NBA. And I got to know O'Brien from about 1981 to 1983. And I did ask him one day about David Halberstam. Well, it wasn't David Halberstam. Halberstam suggested that Johnson was quitting because he lost Cronkite. But I said I asked Larry O'Brien, I said, is it true that Johnson said, that's it, I'm out of here because of what Cronkite said? And he said that if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the nation. Now, O'Brien was part of John F. Kennedy's Boston Mafia of Kenny O'Donnell and Powers and Theodore Sorensen. And he stayed on and worked with Johnson as his liaison to Congress. And he said, no, he said, Lyndon would not be worried too much about what Walter Cronkite said. However, on the other hand, as we found out subsequently, Johnson did complain to Bill Paley at CBS to get the boys off of his back, which actually ended up getting Tommy Smothers a surprising letter from Lyndon Johnson after Johnson was assured he wasn't going to be president anymore. February 12th, that date probably doesn't mean very much to you, but it was an important day in American history if you look back at it retrospectively. The Memphis sanitation strike started, and that strike would last until April 16th. 1968. And as it turns out, it would have an impact on American history. Nobody knew it at the time when the Memphis sanitation strike started. March 17th, there was a major protest in London against the United States involvement in Vietnam. There was violence, 91 people injured, 200 arrested, and that video made it to the United States and was shown on Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley and Howard K. Smith in those days. Richard Nixon wins the Oregon primary on March 16th. The next day, or that day, Robert F. Kennedy decides to jump into the presidential race for the Democratic nomination. And Nixon said, oh, those Kennedys, something very strange happens when they're around. I don't know if Nixon was a soothsayer, seer, or just was blowing off steam, but you gotta wonder, because he was right. March 31st, Lyndon Johnson says he's not seeking re-election. He's not going to serve his country. He's stepping down once his term is over. That is the beginning of 5 crucial days in the United States. That is the Martin Luther King Center. That is my wife in Atlanta. That's in 2015. And I don't know how many of you, if any of you have ever gone to the Martin Luther King Center. I've done that twice in 2004 and 2015. It's one thing that I love to do is travel and go places, which I can't do because of COVID-19. And so anyway, took a picture of my wife walking with the people who supposedly walked through the South, beginning with Rosa Parks and the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, where she refused to give up her seat around 1955, through the Freedom Rides, through the marches and the Pettus Bridge and all of that. You have a middle-aged man, older man. My wife behind her is a man who lost his leg in Vietnam, an everyday housewife. And they just take you through a tour of where Martin Luther King and the other marchers went through the South. And that's where Martin Luther King is buried, because on April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was in Memphis supporting the strikers, the Memphis sanitation workers. It's the Lorraine Hotel. It's 6:01 local time. And shots ring out. Hits Martin Luther King right here in the chin. He goes backwards. He's virtually dead as soon as the bullet hits him. It came to Robert Kennedy. He's campaigning in Indianapolis on April 4th that night. And Robert Kennedy, because there was no such thing as this, and not too many people had transistor radios at the time that were there, it's Robert Kennedy who has to tell the crowd that Martin Luther King is dead. He's the senator from New York. He had been the Attorney General of the United States. And he is credited with keeping the lid on violence in Indianapolis that night with this paragraph. For those of you who are Black and tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to go beyond these rather difficult times. With that paragraph, Bobby Kennedy probably calmed the feelings in Indianapolis. That's the hardest working man in showbiz. I feel good. James Brown. And James Brown plays a role in quelling whatever violence might have happened in Boston. He's there to give a concert, but the city doesn't know whether or not he should give a concert. That is Kevin White, who was the mayor of Boston at the time. And there's some tense negotiations back and forth, but James Brown says, you know what, I'll control my people. I'll control my people. And Kevin White took him at his word. And he starts giving the concert. And there's a little rumble going on. James Brown yells, wait a minute, now wait, step down, be a gentleman. Now I've asked the police to step back because I think I could get some respect from my own people. Brown successfully restored order while keeping police away from the crowd, and he is credited with keeping the lid on violence in Boston. Martin Luther King on the left, Jackie Robinson on the right. Jackie Robinson was the first Negro player in Major League Baseball since 1884. Moses Fleetwood played with Toledo along with his brother Weldy. They were both with the Toledo Club of the American Association, which was Major Leagues back in the 1880s. And after that, black players disappeared from baseball until 1947. Jackie Robinson played with the Brooklyn Dodgers, team that was owned by Walter O'Malley at the end of his career. O'Malley hated Jackie Robinson. In fact, he traded Jackie Robinson to the New York Giants for Don Littlefield after the 1956 season. Jackie actually had some Giant gear, but announced his retirement to become the vice president of Chock full of Nuts. Technically, Jackie Robinson did not end his career with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Rather, he ended his career with the New York Giants. That was 1956. About 11 and a half years later, Martin Luther King, who was not really on the scene in 1956, is killed, and there's a period of mourning, and then there's the burial. Major League Baseball had no idea what to do, absolutely no idea what to do, and the commissioner, William Spike Eckert, the Army general, left it up to the individual owners to decide whether they were going to play or not. Bill White was the New York Yankees announcer in the 1970s and 1980s, who I got to know over the years. And we talked about what happened after after Martin Luther King was assassinated, because Bill White and his Philadelphia Phillies teammates were going to refuse to play Walter O'Malley's Los Angeles Dodgers on the day of Martin Luther King's funeral. O'Malley was going to play. Bill White said, I've endured too much and this man is dead for me not to honor him the day of his funeral. But O'Malley was going to go ahead and play anyway. On the morning of April 9th, Walter O'Malley met with his general manager, Buzzy Baez, and afterwards said that the home opener would be postponed. Wouldn't have mattered. Well, he would have won because it would have been a forfeit because the Philadelphia Phillies, led by Bill White, that baseball team was not going to show up, and they weren't going to relent about not showing up. And O'Malley finally went with the rest of the crowd and postponed the game. That's Washington, D.C. Washington looks like a battle zone. That's around April 7th, April 8th, rioting in the streets in Washington, D.C. It was the greatest wave of social unrest in the United States experienced since the Civil War. Some of the biggest riots took place in Washington, Baltimore, Chicago, where Richard Daley was the mayor, in Kansas City. In Chicago, Dick Daley told his police to shoot to kill the rioters. He didn't care. Nothing was going to sully his city, and he was in control of his city. Dick Daley would come back a number of months later and have a center role again in what was going on in 1968. Through it all, Lyndon Johnson did sign a Civil Rights Act of 1968. This one, a minor Civil Rights Act, but one that effectively prohibited housing discrimination based on race. That took place in 1968. In other words, no more redlining. You have to show Negro couples, not quite African-American couples at this point, Negro couples, Negro individuals, the same apartment you would show a white person. That's what that was all about. Does the name Mark Rudd ring a bell? See, I'm using all these 1960 isms, ring a bell, can you dig it? That's not his bag. Anyway, Vietnam War, center stage still. Martin Luther King is dead, but Vietnam War is still center stage. Mark Rudd, the head of the Students for Democratic Society, leads protesters at Columbia University. They take over the administration buildings and shut down the university. A couple of years ago, I spoke at a place in Whippany, New Jersey, and there was a woman who was friends with Mark Rudd's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rudd. And she was telling me the story that Mrs. Rudd's telling her one day. She said, Mark called us the other day, and we asked, well, what was going on? And she said, that, we're thinking of taking over the Treasury. And my husband said to Mark, what do you want that for? Do something else. You don't need the Treasury. Find something else to do. Well, They were taking over universities. Mark Rudd from New Jersey, Students for Democratic Society. Meanwhile, the United States is not the only place there is unrest. There is unrest in France in May of 1968. That translates to stop stop the intentional bombing. Sorry about that. My French, little shaky since my days of Joyce Tuck at Spring Valley High School back in 1970. Stop the bombing in North Vietnam. And the French knew a lot about Vietnam. It was a colony until 1954 when they decided to get out of there because the Civil War broke out between the North and South. The Americans came in because they were worried about something called the domino theory. If South Vietnam went, Thailand would go, Laos would go, Cambodia would go, India would go, even Australia and New Zealand, all under the grip of the Soviet bear. And anyway, that was back in 1968. And it was a socialist strike, demonstrations, mass general strikes, and occupation of university and factories. Eventually, Charles de Gaulle would negotiate a truce with the strikers and would offer some reforms in 1969. And it would be up to the French whether or not to keep the reforms or vote for the reforms or not vote for the reforms. The French decided about 53 to 47. They didn't want de Gaulle's reforms, and he was gone, and that ended Charles de Gaulle on the stage in France. History's Mysteries. There's once on a TV show called History's Mysteries on the Arts and Entertainment Network. It was done by a company called Triage Entertainment. Triage. Anyway, that was 1999, but History Mystery. I have a question. And you know what? If you're listening and if you do want to type in chat right now, I'm going to ask this question and you can type it in yes or no. Had Bobby Kennedy lived, would he have been the Democratic nominee for president in 1968? And the second question, because I would have asked this live, and the second question is, if he was the Democratic nominee, would he have beaten Richard Nixon? And I'll get around to answering that after the Democratic, my opinion anyway, after the Democratic convention comes up on here. But those are the two questions if you care to answer or ask or answer at that point, and we can talk about it. You can do that in Zoom. My friend Shelley Salt, I have some tentacles that reach out to the assassination of Robert Kennedy back in 1968. One was my friend Shelley Saltman, who grew up with Ted Kennedy up in Boston, who is a promoter, who you might remember in the 1970s, who was beaten up by Evel Knievel after the Snake River Canyon jump. Shelley Saltman grew up with Teddy Kennedy, and he knew the Kennedy family in Boston. And Shelley's father was heavily involved in Boston Democratic machine politics, so he knew the Kennedys. And Shelley was promoting golf tournaments at the time, and one of his clients was Andy Williams. And he gets the call the morning of the California Democratic primary from Andy Williams. And Andy says, hey, listen, Shelley, Bobby needs a quiet place. He's got to write 2 speeches. He's got to write one if he wins, and he's got to write one if he loses. Now, he needs a quiet place. Can you suggest anything? And Shelley told me the story. He said, well, I was going to Denver. So I said, Andy, you know where my office is. You've been there so many times. You know my secretary. Just bring Bobby with you and just go in my office. Use my desk. Don't worry about it. So he did. And Bobby wrote the speeches at Shelley's desk. The other is Rosie Greer. About 1983, 1984, as a reporter, I got to interview Rosie Greer. He was a guy who knitted a lot. And he wrote a book about knitting. 6'5", 300 pounds, tough defensive lineman. You would never think that he would be knitting, but he wrote a book about knitting. And as a reporter, sometimes to get to where you want to go, you have to play along with the PR people who are presenting the person to you and sell the product, or say you're going to sell the product. I wasn't interested in that. What I was interested in was Bobby Kennedy had no security guards in California. The two guys who protected him were 6'5", 300-pound Rosie Greer, and also Rayford Johnson, who is an Olympic decathlonist. And wherever Bobby went, they went. Now, I found out subsequently, Bobby wasn't a very tall man. He was about 5'7", 5'8", wasn't very tall. And so these two guys would be mountainous protecting him. Here, Kennedy's giving his speech at the Ambassador Hotel. Thank you for winning and all that other stuff. And it's over, you know, and I've covered politics. I've covered politics in my life. Like I said, I covered Reagan, I covered Teddy Kennedy on the presidential level. I did an interview with Bill Clinton. I knew George Bush from his baseball days. And certainly I've known Trump since 1983, because anybody who covered anything in New York has known Trump forever. I do know one thing, that when these people are in situations like that, they take a back exit out where they don't have to mingle with people. And in Bobby Kennedy's case, it was a pantry off on the side of the hall. And Sirhan is waiting there for him. How he's there, that question has never really been answered. Rosie Greer is next to him, and so is Rayford Johnson. And I wanted to know from Rosie Greer, I said, what possessed you to knock the gun out of Sirhan's hand and broke Sirhan's arm? And Rosie said, I have no idea. I just reacted. Rosie has carried that for 52 years. He could have done a better job. He didn't do it. Kennedy, of course, was killed. And Shelley actually worked on that from St. Patrick's Cathedral, the railroad, and taking the train down to Arlington National Cemetery for the burial. Shelley actually worked on that. Now, would Bobby have gotten the nomination? Probably not, which means he probably would not have beaten Nixon. Now, the reason why I say that is Hubert Humphrey was running. He took Johnson's place. He was Johnson's vice president. The Kennedys and the Johnsons hated one another, absolutely hated one another, as books have pointed out. And as Shelley has told me, and others who have told me over the years, Bobby, this was a test run for 1972. This was not supposed to happen in 1968. He got into the race on March 17th. His brother, when he ran for president in 1960, got into the race on January 2nd, 1960. There was no infrastructure for Bobby Kennedy. There was no money. He was just going around doing whatever he could, and he was gathering votes. He had a whole bunch of very, very young operatives. You might have heard of some of the young operatives. Jerry Springer was one of his operatives. Bob Arum, who later on in life would become a boxing promoter. Jeff Greenfield, who was on CNN, on ABC, he was another one of his advisors. And they understood that they were getting involved with Bobby Kennedy, not for 1968, but for 1972, because that's where the prize was. This was the test run, according to the people who I've spoken to over the years. So, history's mysteries. Would he have won the Democratic primary? Too many Johnson people there. Unless there was a backroom deal cut, he was not going to get the delegates because he got in too late to win the delegates. And then that makes the second point moot, whether or not he beat Nixon. Now, a lot of people think that he would have beaten Richard Nixon in 1968, but you can't beat Nixon unless you're there. And Nixon, and the other part that the Democrats had was George Wallace was a Democrat. And George Wallace was going to siphon off Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana and Tennessee, which made it much harder for a Democratic candidate because that's where Wallace was, that's where his base was in 1968. Now, meanwhile, over in Czechoslovakia, there is the Prague Spring, which actually started in the winter. And 2 years ago, I was on a cruise ship doing this talk, celebrity cruise ship in the Caribbean. And there was a woman from Chicago. She was sitting in her walker, and she looks at this picture and she says to me, it was so beautiful. It was so beautiful. We're talking about the Prague Spring. I said, were you there? And she says, oh, yes, I was there. I was in Bratislava, which is now the capital of Slovakia, but it was one country at that point. I was in Bratislava, and I would be walking around, and you wouldn't look over your shoulder anymore to see who might report you. And the poets were writing, and the guitar players were there at the cafes. It was so beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. And at that point, I left the stage and just did an interview with her, a journalist, and everybody was fascinated by her story. Her story continued. She says, it's August 20th, 1968. Freedom to a point. And she says she's sitting in her house, an apartment in Bratislava. And she says, Mama says to me, why are there airplanes flying at 11 o'clock at night in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia? And she looks out the window and she sees tanks in the street. Why are there tanks in the street in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia at 11 o'clock at night on August 20th? Well, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries, basically the Soviet Union, came in to crush the Prague Spring. For this woman, she still had a visa. She was going on holiday to Belgium after the Jewish holidays. I say the Jewish holidays because there's another part to the story. And she and her mother are going to Belgium, but they have a change of plans, at least in their mind. And instead of going to Belgium, to the hotel in Brussels, they go right to the American consulate, and they say, we're seeking asylum. 72 hours later, because they had people in Skokie, Illinois that were sponsoring them, they were in Chicago, Skokie, Illinois, and beginning the rest of their lives as Americans fleeing Czechoslovakia, although she did go back to Czechoslovakia. The other thing, she was the first woman I ever met or first person I ever met, who was a Raoul Wallenberg survivor. Raoul Wallenberg saved her and her mother by writing up something to get them away to a safe haven, and they returned to Czechoslovakia after World War II was done. The woman is also did an interview with Steven Spielberg's people for about a half hour, and her Holocaust story is going to be forever. It's there forever, because Spielberg, that was part of his project, and she was interviewed by his people. The Prague Spring began on January 5th. The Alexander Dubček, he was the prime minister, first secretary of the Communist Party, led reforms. And it ends officially, at least according to the Soviets, on August 21st, 1968, but it ended on August 20th. Might as well not split hairs, right? And that's Pol Pot. He is in Cambodia. The killing fields of Cambodia will come later on, but he begins his ascent in 1968 as the Khmer Rouge was officially formed, and its forces launched an insurgency across Cambodia. North Vietnam provided shelter and weapons to the Khmer Rouge. The Beatles still at the height of their fame, although they quit touring 2 years earlier. They put out a song called Revolution, a John Lennon written song, which actually doesn't go anywhere. It's not as sharp a song as Bob Dylan would write, Tom Paxson would write, Joan Baez would write, Peter, Paul, and Mary would sing, or Pete Seeger would write. It's a song, it's kind of a mishmash song, but there's going to be a revolution, and you know, Chairman Mao, you can count me in, you can count me out. It was a very naive song. However, naive or not, it signaled that the rock and rollers, led by the Beatles, were going to get involved in the protest, which the folkies had done until that point. I have a friend, Richard Lee. He's at St. Bonaventure's University in Western New York, who does a talk called "Was Rock Music the Soundtrack of Global Protests Against Vietnam?" And for 90 minutes, Rich will make an argument or make a case that it was, and it might have been. The rock musicians replaced the folkies like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Tom Paxson and Country Joe and those people, Country Joe and the Fish, and Arlo Guthrie. Although Arlo Guthrie claims that Alice's Restaurant was not a protest song, it was a stupidity song. But all of a sudden, that opens the door for Jim Morrison to sing about protests in New Haven, and eventually Stephen Stills, something going on here in Ohio eventually. So the Beatles opened the door that way. The cultural protests merged with political demonstrations, and Lennon writes the ultimate slogan song, "Give Peace a Chance," in 1969. Oh, why is that man smiling? I knew Nixon. Nixon lived in Park Ridge, and my first dealings with Nixon were in 1985 when he was the arbitrator of the Major League Baseball umpires dispute with the owners. They were looking for more money. Richie Phillips, who was the head of the umpires union, lived in Society Hill in Philadelphia off the main line, and his neighbors were Julie and David Eisenhower, and he would see Dick and Pat being grandparents. Dick and Pat Nixon would be down there every weekend watching the kids, and Richie told the baseball commissioner, Peter Uberoth, let's go to arbitration. He says, so you got mine. He says, how about Dick Nixon? Dick Nixon, get out of here. You sure? He said, how do you know him? He said, yeah, Julie and David are my next door neighbors. And Nixon would come back into proper society as a senior statesman, not because of the David Frost interviews, but because he was asked to arbitrate the baseball dispute. And I got to see him a couple dozen times over the years after that, to the point where he actually knew my name. And I would call him Mr. President or President Nixon. He said, no, call me Dick. Call me Dick. Yeah, call me Dick. Dick Nixon. Anyway, he wins the Republican nomination. And he's the Republican standard bearer. And that's Pegasus the Pig. He wins the nomination of the Yippie Party. They're running a candidate in 1968, Theater of the Absurd, prior to the Chicago Democratic Convention, led by people like Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. We're not sure what happened to Pegasus after he and Lady Pegasus and the Piglets were arrested. The word is that A, they were dinner somewhere, or B, they lived out their lives on a farm in Iowa. But Pegasus was arrested by Chicago police. Political theater, the Youth International Party, they're not youth anymore. They are the generation that listens to Joe Namath tell them how to get extra insurance besides your Medicare plan today. That was 52 years ago. So they nominate Pegasus, who was arrested with Jerry Rubin, others for disorderly conduct by the Chicago police. Hubert Humphrey is going to be the Democratic nominee. Kennedy's out of the way. McCarthy is not going to be, he's too far away in the delegate count. And then there's George Wallace, but George Wallace is not part of the Democratic machine anymore. So he is going to be the candidate. There would be protests in the streets of Chicago outside the convention. And of course, Vietnam, the significant issue. That is the Hilton Hotel in Chicago. And on that same cruise ship that woman was on, who told me about the Prague Spring, was another woman. There were 6 people from Chicago overall on that cruise ship, all who were around Chicago in 1968, including a 16-year-old kid who was upset because he couldn't play softball at Grant Field. And I said, you know, I bet you were the Hamm's beer drinker. And he looked at me and said, how'd you know? I said, how old were you in 1968? 16. I said, just had that guess that you were the Hamm's beer drinker. Hamm's beer was a big beer in Chicago. Peter Ham ran Hamm's beer. And anyway, so this woman said she's on top of the Hilton Hotel looking down. And she said that, I didn't ask her why she was there, but she was there. And she said you could see the police here, you could see the protesters there, and you could see both sides are just itching for a fight or a rumble. Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin had vowed to lead the Vietnam War protesters to Chicago to disrupt the conventions, and the TV cameras were on. The mayor of the city of Chicago, Dick Daley. Dick Daley was kind of paranoid by this point. After all, in April, he had the problems with the rioting after Martin Luther King, but he had heard somebody say, these guys, Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, are going to take a whole batch of LSD. They're going to load them up into these big trucks and dump them in the water supply in Lake Michigan. And everybody in Chicago then would get high or act like Groucho Marx, who was one of the first people who pushed LSD back in the 1940s, which was legal for a good long time until like 1965, 66, somewhere around there. Anyway, so they're going to go down to the amphitheater, which is in the meatpacking part of Chicago. And Dick Daley is worried about everybody in Chicago is going to drink water that is tainted or filled with LSD. That didn't happen, nor did the protesters go down to the amphitheater. They settled for the Hilton Hotel. Daley made it clear that he would not block any attempts, or he would block all attempts to disrupt the convention or sully the city's name. Gunga Dan, Dan Rather, that was his nickname around CBS, Gunga Dan, and Mike Wallace. His brother, Irv Wallace, was an economist who gave advice to Dwight Eisenhower and also John F. Kennedy. He's an economist, Irv. Anyway, they were roughed up in the convention, asking questions, and they got roughed up by some of the delegates. And that brings me to 2020 and news in 2020 and news in 1968 and old Iron Pants himself, Walter Cronkite. Now, Cronkite was a true professional, never raised his voice, no arguing back and forth, true consummate professional. So Walter Cronkite's getting very upset here, seeing that Gunga Dan and Wallace are being roughed up. And he says, and he's like asking the audience, can I say that? Can I say that? I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, if I may be permitted to say so. Walter Cronkite at the 1968 convention. Hubert Humphrey would win the convention, and there would be arrests. The Chicago 8 became the Chicago 7. They would be arrested. The TV cameramen were right in front of the Conrad Hilton Hotel, right where they were supposed to be on August 28th. And the red light goes on. The crowd is chanting, the whole world's watching, the whole world's watching, the whole world's watching. And the rumble takes place between the protesters and the cops. The Chicago Tribune. The Chicago Tribune was run back in the 30s by Colonel McCormick, who also ran the New York Daily News. And he was a member of the America First Committee. Oh, and they had people over the years who were, I wouldn't exactly call liberal op-ed writers like Robert Novak. In fact, nobody in Chicago would ever call the Chicago Tribune a liberal paper. But the editorial about the Democratic Convention, many convention visitors were appalled at what they considered unnatural enthusiasm of the police for the job of arresting demonstrators. Oh, and there he is. Look at that face. Look at that face. Only a mother could love that face. There is Dick Daley. He does not like what's going on in Chicago with the protests and everything else. And he is particularly incensed at this moment by the Democratic senator from the state of Connecticut, Abraham Riverkoff. Daley did everything he could to curtail the voices of those speaking against the war and also against Chicago. The Chicago 8, consisting of Abbie Hoffman, Tom Hayden, Dave Dellinger, Rennie Davis, John Fournies, Jerry Rubin, Lee Weiner, no relation to me, and Bobby Seale. Bobby Seale, because of courtroom antics, would be taken off with the rest of these guys and charged with other things and tried separately. In February of 1970, 5 of the remaining Chicago 7 conspirators were convicted of the intent to incite a riot while crossing state lines. The Supreme Court would overthrow that ruling in 1971. The convictions were eventually reversed on appeal. The Democrats, Humphrey is the guy. Now, meanwhile, while all of this is going on, a couple other things are going on. These are women in their 20s, in their 30s, and they want to change the world. And they are following Betty Friedan, who founded the National Organization of Women 2 years earlier in 1966, and wrote the book, which you probably have at the library, called The Feminine Mystique. which initially Betty Friedan wanted to write about her former classmates at Smith College. She graduated in 1957, and she's doing this thing in 1962, and she's trying to sell a magazine piece, and none of the magazines are taking it. So she writes the book, The Feminine Mystique, and that starts the women's liberation movement. Now forms in 1966, and women are now looking to do something else to get attention. On August 22nd, the radical women in New York invited women of every political persuasion to Atlantic City, the boardwalk, on September 7th, the day of the Miss America contest. Hopefully they weren't going to go easy on Burt Parks. After all, he had to sing that night. Burt lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, and people who I knew from way back when, because he used to play hockey up there, thought the world of Burt Parks, nicest guy in the world. But anyway, I digress here. What they wanted was that the protesters, they would protest the image of Miss America, an image that oppresses women in every area in which it purports to represent us. The protest would feature a freedom trash can into which women could throw away all the physical manifestations of women's oppression: bras, girdles, curlers, false eyelashes, wigs, and representative issues of Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal, and Family Circle. Now, if I was live right now with you, I'd look around the room, I'd scan around the room, and I would ask, any women in here burn their bra in 1968? And sometimes I get answers like, are you kidding me? You must be a man. Do you know how much those things cost and how difficult it is to find one that fits correctly? How dare you ask us that, not know the facts? There was a woman told me that in Teaneck, New Jersey. And there were others who, one woman said, well, I never wore one, so does that count? Back in the 1960s. The whole thing about did you burn your bra was a very effective PR tool for the women's lib movement. As you can see, here we go. This is Atlantic City. And these two women are throwing their bras into the freedom trash can. And take a look behind the reporter. Look on the right side. There is a woman there who's wearing a bra outside of her dress, and that bra presumably was going to go into the freedom trash can and be burnt. So the slogan was actually pretty effective, because not only did it get women's attention, but it got men's attention. That was a big deal to get a man's attention, because, hey, there may be something else there. But all of a sudden, they're able to sell their story to men as well. It was a very clever PR move by the National Organization of Women. The 1968 protest, including the Burn Your Bra slogan, did not change the Miss America pageant, but network television, but they did introduce feminism into the mainstream consciousness and expand the national conversation about the rights and liberation of women. So that slogan actually worked. Meanwhile, why is that man smiling? Richard Nixon. I can tell you from personal experience, because I dealt with him for about 4 years, Richard Nixon was not a particularly warm or fuzzy man, nor did he have a quip or a joke, unless you consider you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore in 1962. But he ends up on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. And Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, Sock It To Me. Remember Judy Carn, the Sock It To Me girl who got water thrown at her and she got all wet. And that became a catchphrase. John Wayne, Sock It To Me. Nixon somehow knew George Slatter, and Roger Ailes was around at this point, working in network TV, and somehow he is talked into going on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In to say, sock it to me, 4 words. Hubert Humphrey was also invited, but declined because he thought it was beneath the president's dignity. Nixon didn't think so. He changes how people run for president. Bill Clinton could play the saxophone on Arsenio Hall. Candidates could go on Stephen Colbert and announce their presidential intentions. Arnold Schwarzenegger could go on the Jay Leno show and say, I'm going to run for governor. There was no more having to go on these prim and proper shows with Lawrence Spivak on Meet the Press and have this news conference, or you could go on a comedy show. Rowan and Martin's Laughing, and Richard Nixon, who changed TV debates in 1960, presidential debates, because he had a 5 o'clock shadow. He had a bad knee, so he was kind of slumped over while he was standing on the podium. And he looked like he had walked off the IRT on July 23rd during rush hour on a 100-degree day with no air conditioning in the subway car that he was trampled in. All became about appearance. Kennedy was immaculate. His suit matched the backdrop, even though it was in black and white, because Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, ran the studio. They knew all about lighting. So Nixon changes presidential running politics in the 1960s because of what he looks like in 1960 in the first debate and going on Rowan and Martin's Laughing. Sock it to me, Dick Nixon. Smothers Brothers are getting more in trouble. They submit their shows on 10-day tape delay so the censors could thoroughly vet them. And the season opener of the 1968-69 season, Harry Belafonte has a segment cut out, and there's 4.5 minutes of ads for Richard Nixon instead of Harry Belafonte. Pat Paulson is running for president. Somewhere in my files, I have old self-addressed stamped envelopes of Pat Paulson editorials on the Smothers Brothers show. He was the editorialist, and his deadpan, double-talk comments on the issues of the day resonated with 12-year-olds like me. He would run for president in 72, 76, 80, 84, 88, 92. And he wasn't even supposed to do anything on the show. And he all of a sudden was this comedian who became, whose satire, and you know what? Nobody has ever done anything like it. Stephen Colbert did try to run for president, but he wasn't the first. Pat Paulson was. Jose Feliciano. Jose Feliciano, who's 23 years old at the time, blind guitar player. He's got a seeing eye dog, singing the national anthem. He's from Puerto Rico with a calypso beat. He's with guys behind him who look like they perform weekly at the VFW, don't they? The juxtaposition is kind of weird. But anyway, he sings the national anthem. Ernie Harwell, the Detroit Tigers announcer, saw him somewhere and recommended to the Tigers, hey, why don't you have him do the national anthem before Game 5 of the World Series between the Cardinals and the Detroit Tigers in October of 1968. He does, and he does it calypso style. He adds a twist to it, the Latin twist. The Tiger Stadium crowd responded with boos and cheers. Some thought he was un-American. Feliciano is from Puerto Rico. He is American. Irate callers called NBC. They did the baseball game, and also the Detroit Tigers front office, screaming and yelling. Now, Jose Feliciano's version, which was seen on TV, of the national anthem was unpatriotic. And how could you allow a foreigner doing that, even though he's American? Down in Mexico, they're having the 1968 Olympics, and the Mexicans decide that they're going to crack down on dissent, because there is dissent going on. There was a group called the CNH, made up of students from 70 universities and preparatory schools, and they were protesting. And what were they protesting? Social rights, equal educational opportunities, and they wanted political reform. And it was October 2nd, and there were 10,000 university and high school students in the main plaza of Mexico City, and they're there for a protest and listen to speeches. The Mexican army comes around at 5:55. Red flares are shot. They want to get the students out of there. 6:15, 2 more flares are shot from a helicopter. All of a sudden, 5,000 soldiers, 20 tanks, and trucks surround the plaza. Many died, many were arrested. The Mexican government story, still to this day, 52 years later, is We heard that some of the protesters were going to go after each other, and we were only there to protect the protesters. That theory has been debunked, but officially, according to the Mexican government, that's what happened, even though members of the Mexican government have said that's not what happened. But they were cleaning up because the Mexico City Olympics were taking place in about 3 weeks afterwards. And here you have one of the ultimate sports protests, Tommy Smith, I was going to say that it was the 10-meter dash. It was the meter dash. Anyway, it's Peter Norman is there on the left from Australia, as you can see. Tommy Smith, who won the dash, is there in the middle. John Carlos is there on the right. They are all wearing little patches from the Olympics movement for human rights. Peter Norman borrowed his from an American. Smith and Carlos are also wearing other things. If you look at Carlos on the right with the number 9, you see beads around his neck. That signifies lynching. They are not wearing shoes. That signifies, I'm going to quit that word. That shows off poverty in the United States. Avery Brundage, who is the head of the International Olympic Committee, didn't like that. The Olympics not a place for protest. Peter Norman, who is part of the Olympic Project for Human Rights, or supporting it, was blackballed in Australia because he was the guy who suggested to Smith and Carlos to split their gloves, one putting the glove on the right hand, the other on the left hand in some sort of salute. Norman supported the two people running in this particular race. He gets back to Australia, he literally becomes a non-person. He is denied the right, even though he did go through the process and won many races to represent Australia in 1972. Meanwhile, Smith and Carlos are thrown out of the Olympic Village. They do get to keep their medals. Smith ended up playing in the American Football League prior to the National Football League merger with the Cincinnati Bengals. Carlos was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles, was injured, but played in the Canadian Football League, Montreal Alouettes, which is kind of interesting because if they were around now, Smith and Carlos would have probably been blackballed from the National Football League. In 2012, 6 years after his death, the Australian Parliament apologized to Peter Norman for the way the country treated him. Nixon would win. Winning is more fun, says a tearful Hubert Humphrey as he concedes. Nixon pledges unity. Nothing ever changes. Look at the Toronto Daily Star, now just called the Star. Ottawa worried Nixon's policies could hit us in the pocketbook. Why did Hubert Humphrey lose? Well, simple. He didn't break with Lyndon Johnson on Vietnam. Didn't break. There's some sort of skullduggery that people talked about that Nixon somehow met with the widow of Claire Chennault. Shout out to Stewie Gates, my 9th grade teacher at Spring Valley Junior High School in social studies. He used to talk about Claire Chennault and the Burma Hump and the Flying Tigers during World War II. For some reason, Stewie Gates just resonates with me. And he's alive and well in Stony Point, just retired from fighting fires. He's about 91, 92 years old now. But anyway, Nixon allegedly met with Claire Chennault's widow, and they spoke to the North Vietnamese and said, hold off on peace talks until we get elected and we'll give you a better deal. That's never been proven, but it's a conspiracy that was out there. Lyndon Johnson did call Nixon asking about it, and Nixon denied it. Anyway, if Humphrey broke with Johnson, who knows? But he didn't break with Johnson, and the Vietnam policy stayed intact. And he lost. And George Wallace did take the votes away from Humphrey in the Electoral College, or Nixon, in Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Louisiana. Oh, the Big E, Elvis taking care of business. Elvis comes back, puts the leather back on, forgets about those cheesy movies, including singing songs about the IRS or chasing girls in all of those movies. And he puts the leather back on, straps on the guitar. This is actually in June of 1968. And NBC shows it on December 3rd, 1968, the Elvis comeback special. Elvis is back. It's straight to Las Vegas, where Elvis would become a fixture until he dies in 1977. But Elvis is back, the comeback special. 1968 ends with the Apollo 8 mission. Now, the Apollo 8 mission was not supposed to go around the moon. The Apollo 8 mission was supposed to be a docking maneuver with the lunar lander, except Grumman and Bethpage out on the island didn't have the lunar lander ready. So instead, they go around the moon. Jim Lovell, along with Bill Anders and Frank Borman, and they circle the moon. I have a friend by the name of Dick Hull, and I do some space Cold War talks with space heavily included. Dick worked for NASA between, say, 1960 and 1974. And Dick has told me a lot of stories, some of them very much off the record, about how lucky the Americans were getting to the moon. But anyway, making a long story short, Dick told me that the most mail that NASA ever got from any mission was from this mission, not the lunar landing. And the reason why, circling the moon on Christmas Eve, Frank Borman, who ended up being the president and putting Eastern Airlines into the ground, Jim Lovell, who played an older astronaut talking to young Jim Lovell in the movie Apollo 13, and Bill Anders read passages from the Bible, from Genesis. And they said the earth is good. Don't mess with the earth. Enjoy Christmas Eve, peace on earth, all that other stuff. Take a break from the war in Vietnam. Take a break from the war that's going on in Nigeria with Biafra. Take a break from what's going on in the Middle East. Take a break from the Cold War. Let's see if there's some hope in the world. And with that, they got more than their share of mail, the three of them, the most mail that NASA ever got for a mission. The problems in 1968 come to an end on December 31st, but they really don't come to an end. 1968 would shape generations to come, and 1969, there would be new people on the world stage: Nixon, Golda Meir, Yasser Arafat, Assad in Syria, Gaddafi in Libya. But the problems still remain in 69 and 70, and actually shape us to this day. Thank you very much, Victoria, for inviting me. Any questions, any comments on this? I know that it was a little long on that, but do we have any questions or comments?
I'm going to go ahead and start allowing people to unmute. So if anyone wants to ask aloud, or if you just want to put it in the chat, I'm happy to read your questions out for you.
Back in the day in Nanuet, right by the thruway, there used to be protesters that would stand every Saturday morning where the Holiday Inn was. Now it's Target and a number of other things. Used to be a Spring Valley Airport there. Every Saturday morning they'd be standing there, about 12 of them protesting.
I lived in Nanuet. Both sides would be on either side of 59 yelling at each other.
Yeah.
All right, I see some people unmuting, so go ahead and ask your questions.
It's not so much a question, but as we all know, this has been an eventful year, 2020. I wonder how historians will look at 2020, if it's looked at the same way as what you're looking at, or what we look at in 1968, which also had a lot of different events going on. So it'll be interesting to see, 20 years from now or 50 years from now, how 2020 is viewed.
Well, somebody 50 years from now is going to give the talk about 2020, and my suspicion, when somebody, even 20 years from now, is that coronavirus, COVID-19 will be the #1 topic. The #2 topic will be the presidential election now in the United States. Now, the reason I say that I think it'll be COVID-19 is because it's a global pandemic. And it's not just here in the United States, and it impacted so many economies. And also the way you look at it, how come Asia seems to have at least contained it, and how come the United States hasn't? Why is it growing in Canada now? What's happening in Europe? Why is India having a problem? Why is Brazil having a problem? And I think that that's going to color 2020, because the economic breakdown from that. The presidential election will, first of all, it hasn't played out yet. It will, but it hasn't played out totally. But I was thinking about that. If I was doing this 50 years from now, where do you start? And of course, you start with the pandemic, and Pfizer's announcement, which might be good, but there's a way to go there. But the other thing is, in 2020, not 1968. Yesterday I did a talk on 1963. And I put up my cell phone like that, and I said, 2020. We knew about George Floyd because of this. And in doing the talk on 1963, I talked about how John Kennedy got involved in the civil rights movement, fully involved in the civil rights movement, after Martin Luther King kept saying, when's the, what are you going to do something about what's going on? And Kennedy said, well, now's not the time. And Martin Luther King would say, well, when is the time? And in 1963, it became the time, because on the cover of the New York Times on May 5th, 1963, there was a protester who was being bitten by an attack dog, and the television networks went down to Birmingham, Alabama, and there was video of what was going on in Birmingham, Alabama. Cronkite showed it, Huntley Brinkley showed it, Howard K. Smith showed it. So I think when you talk about 2020 and 68, I think there are years in the 60s that there are some comparabilities with the protests in the street, which will be either 2 or 3 in the United States, but actually it might be globally, because there were a lot of protests around the globe as well. But in 2020 it was this, in 63 it was a TV camera. So I think that there's some validity in comparing it. And the commonality may be the network, not the network, but it was TV back then, it's phones today, and it's just the vehicle that. All right, well, thank you, Veronica, I appreciate it. I hope that people, I'm not sure you could enjoy going back to 1968, but I hope people found something within there that they remember or didn't know.
I hope so too. So thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate it that you've joined us today, Evan, and I hope everyone had a great time. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at vreynolds@newcitylibrary.org. Have a great, oh, we've got a hand up.
Okay, still here. I'm not going anywhere. It's pouring outside.